February 1st, 2024, a day I'll never forget. Lewis Hamilton broke the F1 world by announcing his decision to leave Mercedes and join Ferrari for 2025. A story that seemed so far-fetched, I could scarcely believe this was reality. I mean, surely not, right? This is Hamilton and Mercedes we're talking about. There's no way he'd leave after all those years of success. But as much as I wanted to believe that we were living in a simulation, we weren't. Ironically enough, exactly 1 year later, an equally seismic transfer happened in the NBA with Luka Doncic signing with the Lakers. And no matter whether you're a fan of Lewis Hamilton or not, nobody could deny how historic this driver transfer was. The most successful team in Formula One history signing the most successful driver in Formula One history. As such, this was met with a lot of excitement and hype, both the good kind and the bad kind. What do I mean by that? Well, many were hoping to see Lewis get a real opportunity to reclaim his 8th championship with the Scuderia. For 3 years in a row, Mercedes let him down with underwhelming cars. And despite his efforts to try and salvage the situation, Mercedes rarely showed any signs of being able to consistently fight at the front. Maybe the odd race here or there, but Lewis Hamilton doesn't exist to finish second, nor does he care. He exists to win. And he was willing to do whatever it took to get back to the top. If you asked me at the end of last year whether this was a good move, purely from a performance perspective, I would have said, hell yeah. I'd even go as far to say that most people were expecting Ferrari to be fighting for the championship this year, given how strong their car was at the end of 2024. But now we're halfway into the 2025 season, and Ferrari are still winless, with neither of their drivers anywhere remotely close to contending for the title. We covered Charles a couple of weeks ago now, and how his talent is being wasted, and I'm glad that many of you liked it. And today, it's time to cover Lewis's experience with Ferrari so far, the highs, the lows, and what the future might hold. Australia. His first race with the team took place in one of his favourite conditions. Lewis has always been exceptional in the wet, one of the best of all time. And during the crossover point between slicks and inters towards the end of the race, most drivers were struggling to keep the car under control. It wasn't wet enough for inters yet, but at the same time, the track surface was becoming more slippery, lap by lap. Eventually, drivers began coming in to make the switch while others tried to brave it out, barely keeping their car pointing in the right direction. However, there were 2 drivers that managed to master the conditions and extend their stint on the slicks for as long as possible, those 2 being Max and Lewis. Red Bull got the timing just right, as they do most of the time, with the call to bring in the Dutchman. However, Lewis's new race engineer, Riccardo Adami, fed him the wrong information, telling him that there wasn't going to be much rain.
Is more rain coming?
Negative. Just this. Hopefully. Let's see.
And that single moment of miscommunication arguably cost Lewis a spot on the podium on his debut with Ferrari. Had he pitted on the same lap as Verstappen, he would have been right up there. And up until that point, the race was going okay. There were also clear teething issues with the chemistry between him and his race engineer, since Ricky was continuously updating Lewis on every little thing. Probably out of good nature since, it's his first race for Ferrari. But at some point, Hamilton just wanted to be left to race, since the conditions were already tricky enough.
Can use K1, you close.
Into it, please.
K1 available.
Yes, I know. Leave me to it, please.
It wasn't the debut they were hoping for, but the next race was at a track he knows very, very well. And with this being the first sprint weekend of the season, and most drivers on the grid having limited experience around Shanghai, this was a brilliant opportunity for Lewis to achieve a great result.
Hamilton will write a new chapter, and this time it's written in red. Lewis Hamilton wins for Ferrari for the first time in Formula One.
Perfection. That's how many would describe Hamilton's execution on that Friday evening and Saturday afternoon. He was spectacular. From a faultless start to beautiful race management, just vintage Lewis Hamilton. And at the time, it really did feel like this was a breakthrough in him rediscovering his prime. The flame being reignited in scarlet red. And as an avid Lewis fan, this was the first time in a very long time I actually felt something. Some form of belief, some sort of hope, that Ferrari had a car to challenge for the title, and that Lewis was already beginning to click with the SF25. And I'm sure many of you watching felt the same way until he got disqualified in the main race due to excessive plank wear. And this was a big problem, not just for the points lost in Shanghai, but because it revealed something deeper. Ferrari were pushing the limits with their setup, running the SF25 as low as possible to maximize downforce and cornering grip. But in doing so, they went too far. And to avoid a repeat, they were forced to raise the ride height of their car for the upcoming races. And that's where things started to become painful, particularly for Lewis. The SF25 inherently has a very narrow operating window and is designed to thrive when running close to the ground. So even a small compromise could have a knock-on effect on balance, tyre wear, and ultimately, race pace. And for Hamilton, it couldn't have come at a worse time. He was just starting to gel with his car. China felt like the beginning of something, like that old magic was coming back. And then it was all ripped away. The ripple effect of that disqualification would stretch into the next few rounds, since Ferrari now had to err on the side of caution to not risk another DSQ. And Lewis now had to readapt to a car that no longer handled quite the same. It wasn't disastrous, but it was enough to blunt his momentum. In Japan, he could only manage P8 in qualifying. By his own admission, it just wasn't good enough from his side, as Charles was up in P4 and 3/10 quicker. Still carrying that issue from Shanghai, he was clearly not feeling as comfortable in the car as before. Specifically, he was alluding to rear-end instability being the main source of his troubles, along with having the ride height higher than ideal. But this being only his third race with the team, I mean, it wasn't terrible. Sure, he could have been closer to his teammate, but the margins between everyone these days are super tight. A few tenths can be the difference between qualifying on the second row and qualifying on the fourth row. And in an attempt to get a feel for different setups, to see what does and doesn't work with the Ferrari, Lewis ended up with too much understeer come qualifying, which he couldn't dial out. He was able to make his way past Isaac Hadjar pretty comfortably, but ultimately didn't have the pace of the leading 6 cars, including the heir to a seat to Mercedes, Kimi Antonelli. I mean, to see him go long into the first stint, have clean air, but still get gapped by a rookie who was on a softer compound of tyre, that was confusing. All weekend, he just didn't have the pace. But Bahrain was a more encouraging performance, at least on Sunday, because Saturday was a literal nightmare. Again, he admitted that he just didn't do a good enough job and needed to be better, still struggling to really get to grips with this tricky car. The race was better as he made a very strong comeback to 5th place. And that race, Ferrari opted for an alternative strategy to the rest of the top 10, starting on the mediums while everyone else was on the softs. He went long on the first stint and came in for his first stop on lap 18 for another set of mediums. And it was during that middle stint of the race where Hamilton was in the zone, making overtake after overtake, setting a number of fastest laps, and looking much quicker than he did before. And after the woes of the previous day, that second stint in particular provided promise for a potential breakthrough. Despite having to make a lot more overtakes than Leclerc, he only lost about 6 tenths during that phase. And once he cleared that group of cars, he actually started to gain on Charles due to having a much better feeling with the SF25. But in the final stint, that potential started to fade away again. The weekend as a whole was positive for his development in understanding this car since he experienced both the lows and the highs. Pretty much since the start of the season, he's been using Charles as a reference for how to set up his car, and then going on and exploring many different variations to optimize comfortability and performance. It's a trait that has allowed Lewis to be as successful as he's been in his career. James Vowles talked about how he's, quote, like an octopus all over the wheel, as he explores nearly every setting. And he's never afraid to go against the grain of what's considered most optimal by the team. Vowles also mentioned how Lewis uses data merely as a starting point, but it was his feel and natural talent that completely separated him from everybody else, beyond anything Mercedes had ever seen. That explorative nature, though, does come with downsides. Engineers need consistent data to work from to identify patterns and trends to optimize performance. And you can't get that if the driver is changing literally every setting, trying so many different setups and pushing the boundaries on track. But that's exactly what makes Lewis, Lewis. He's always been the kind of driver who doesn't settle for what should work. He relies a lot on feel and oftentimes needs to go his own way to find the strengths and weaknesses of the car. That ability to dig deeper, to trust his intuition, is just one of the many reasons why he's the most decorated driver in history. It's helped him to unlock performance in conditions where everybody else can't. But this season, he's driving a car that feels completely alien to what he's known for the last decade. For instance, the SF25 requires the driver to use engine braking, something that Hamilton has never done before in his career to date. And it makes things especially difficult when you factor in that Lewis's biggest strength and performance advantage over his competitors comes from his astonishingly late braking. It's something Leclerc has mentioned a number of times, marveling at just how incredible Lewis is on the brakes. The manufacturers are also different too, with Ferrari running Brembo, while at Mercedes he used Carbon Industries for years. Add to that the Ferrari power unit, which delivers torque in a totally different way compared to the Mercedes engine he'd grown up with since he was a kid. Many have criticized Lewis for not adapting quickly enough to the Ferrari, failing to consider the sheer magnitude of his career move. It's not as simple as just plug and play. Getting in the car and immediately understanding every aspect of it within just a couple of months is completely unrealistic. Lewis even said after qualifying in Bahrain that he needs, quote, a brain transplant to know how to extract the maximum from the Ferrari. These things take time. The journey isn't smooth, the path isn't straight, and there's no silver bullet to suddenly making the car click. It's a process of discovery and trial and error. And with the SF25 being such a difficult car to drive, the learning process has only been made even more difficult. The car's optimal performance window is extremely small, and Lewis has often mentioned that given Charles has been at the team for much longer, he's able to find that sweet spot very quickly and start the weekend on the right foot, which is why Hamilton has always reverted to moving back closer to his teammate setup when it comes nearer to qualifying. But sometimes that just doesn't work out well for him, and we saw that in Saudi Arabia, where he was just fighting the car every corner. Started P7 and finished there as well. Jeddah has never been one of his strongest tracks. And Miami wasn't much better, but for a different reason. A brilliant call by him in the sprint race to put on the soft tyres at exactly the right time enabled Lewis to secure P3. However, the Ferrari was so far off the pace in qualifying, even slower than Williams throughout the weekend. And during the race, this is where Lewis decided to put his foot down. Starting outside the top 10, he brought himself back in a position to fight for some decent points. During the second stint, he was absolutely flying on the mediums, taking advantage of the battle between Sainz and Leclerc to get past the Williams. Then, since him and Charles were on different strategies, he requested to be let through and make the most of his medium tyres. But Ferrari decided to hit him with the "we are checking," which basically means we'll get back to you in 3 to 5 business days. This has always been one of the long list of factors holding Ferrari back. I like to call it analysis paralysis. It's like they have to go through all the board members and shareholders before they make up their minds. As soon as one of the drivers makes a request, they just freeze and start buffering. And this is the point where Lewis unlocks prime British sarcasm. He was like, yeah, well, have a tea break while you're at it. And I'm genuinely convinced it went all over their heads, probably wondering what the hell a tea break even is. He also rightfully pointed out that in China, he was the one who suggested to the team to let Leclerc through. It wasn't broadcasted on the live feed at the time, but he said, I think I'm gonna let Charles go because I'm struggling, which was the correct decision. Now fast forward to Miami and the roles were reversed. Hamilton was the car behind with the softer tyres and better pace initially, but by the time they asked Leclerc to swap, Hamilton's tyres were already cooked from being in dirty air so long. He was catching Antonelli, but not as fast as Ferrari would have liked, so they decided to swap the cars again, losing even more time to the cars ahead. Charles makes a late race charge, but ran out of laps, and they ended up gaining 0 positions. All this melodrama over 7th and 8th place is actually such peak Ferrari, you couldn't write a script this good. It genuinely would have been more effective if Leclerc and Hamilton just had a direct radio between each other so they can make decisions for themselves. And Lewis was actually a comedian that race, especially that radio at the end, where Adami told him that Sainz was 1.4 seconds behind, and he was like, shall I let him past as well? I'm sorry, I completely lost it. And he almost did. Sainz went for a Hail Mary, but Lewis closed the door. So Fred Vasseur goes to his room after the race. And I don't think he was too pleased with Lewis's radio messages, but he wasn't having any of it. My man just put his hand on his shoulder and said, don't be so sensitive. And honestly, I was happy that Lewis gave them a wake-up call. That indecisiveness just killed their race. And Lewis's feedback shouldn't be taken personally, but as constructive criticism tinged with a bit of humour. They signed him because they want to win, and there's no other driver on the grid who knows how to do that better than Lewis Hamilton. There's so many operational problems that have been deep-rooted within Ferrari for so many years. This moment in Miami, along with Australia, are just 2 examples from this season, and far from being the last. So we then get to Ferrari's home race in Imola, and both drivers have a massive drop-off in pace at the end of Q2, getting eliminated as a result. Starting 12th, Hamilton decided to go with hards on the first stint to go long and gain track position, putting himself in a good place to benefit from a well-timed virtual safety car to pit for new mediums. His pace from that moment was outstanding, making his way up through the order. Then, the full safety car was deployed, enabling him to pit again for a fresh set of hards. Coming back out in 7th place, it was a 10-lap sprint to the end, and brilliantly, he made his way up to 4th, which could have been 3rd with more laps to get after Piastri, but nonetheless, it was a brilliant drive by Hamilton. The car just came alive, and it allowed him to put on an amazing show in front of the Tifosi. Then in Monaco, he was looking good for a P4, but got a 3-place grid penalty for impeding Max in qualifying, only because his race engineer once again fed him the wrong information that Verstappen was on a slow lap, when he was clearly pushing. That's another one for the miscommunication tally. He outqualified Charles in Spain, a small victory, and another sign that 1-lap pace was starting to come together. But on Sunday, it went all downhill. Lewis just fell down the order, struggling with a car that wasn't hooked up. Poor balance, a general lack of grip, and inconsistent handling through the high-speed sections left him fighting the car every single lap. And to make matters worse, both drivers were forced to lift and coast, a problem that has plagued them ever since that disqualification in China. And when you're being forced into management mode for pretty much the entire race, it's very difficult to be competitive. He was ahead of George for many laps, and his prospects weren't looking too bad. However, the Ferrari just seemed to get worse and worse as the race went on. Still, the hope was reset in Canada, one of his favourite tracks on the calendar, and for the 2nd race in a row, outqualifying Leclerc. and starting in P5. But, as I'm sure you can probably tell from this point, Ferrari found a way to throw it all away. It started on Saturday. In Q1, for reasons known only to themselves, they burned through a fresh set of soft tyres to get Lewis through, when they could have just gone with a scrubbed set. And that decision left him with just one new set for Q3. Just another basic operational misstep. And then came Sunday, where they boxed Lewis too early, dropping him straight into a train of midfield traffic. And if you thought things couldn't get any worse, you'd be very, very wrong. Soon, Lewis began reporting brake issues, and they weren't minor. The team somehow had gone with a sub-optimal brake cooling setup, perhaps chasing performance or simply getting the numbers wrong. Whatever the reason was, it completely crippled his car. His brake temps were soaring through the roof, and he had to nurse the car home while others could attack freely. And that's the thing with this SF25. It's not just slow, unpredictable, and undrivable. It's also very fragile. And when you add on top of that the team making fundamental errors from strategy to tyre usage to cooling setup, how do you expect to fight for anything meaningful? And as if that wasn't enough, the cherry on top, Lewis hit a groundhog and sustained floor damage, losing a ton of downforce. Just one more gut punch on a weekend already overflowing with misfortune. To call it unacceptable would be putting it lightly. And all of this came amidst growing rumours that Fred Vasseur was under internal pressure, whispers that he might be sacked, causing nothing but more noise, more speculation, and more instability. It's classic Ferrari, focused on anything but the actual racing. And when things go wrong, they start looking for a scapegoat. But as history has shown us, the problems here aren't about one person. They're systemic, deep-rooted, and cultural. It's a team that for too long has chased quick fixes instead of laying down a proper foundation. And that's exactly what Lewis is trying to change. Just listen to these comments he made after the race. There's a lot of changes that need to be made in the system. There's so many things I wish I could tell you that could explain the problems we've had. My goal is to positively influence, to try and get change so we can have long-term success, because currently, we're not fighting for a championship. These aren't just throwaway lines. These are statements loaded with intent. You can feel the weight behind them. It's been just over half a year, and already, Lewis has seen enough to know that Ferrari is broken in so many ways. And as much as it must frustrate him not to speak freely, he knows that real change doesn't come from outrage. It comes from persistence and patience. Ferrari need Lewis's presence with the team, not just for what he brings behind the wheel, but for what he brings behind the scenes, for the leadership, the vision, the standard. Because if Ferrari are ever going to get back to the top, it won't be through luck. It'll be through facing many uncomfortable truths. The Austrian Grand Prix was better for the team on the whole. Hamilton really wanted that podium and requested to stay out to do a one-stop, but the team overruled him, which was probably for the best, since Charles would have caught up anyway, and he just didn't have the same pace as his teammate. Regardless, those overtakes he was pulling off at turn 6 were just sublime, and that same courage and finesse carried over into his home race at the British Grand Prix. The double pass on Russell and Ocon was pure instinct, candidate for overtake of the year. Then, dancing around the outside of Gasly through Stowe, finding grip where others couldn't. He narrowly missed out on the podium after a valiant fight back, and once again, Ferrari's pit wall faltered, calling him in one lap too late as the rain began to hammer down. And that one misjudgment saw him fall from P4 to P8, as the rest of the field dived into the pits and undercut him with ease. And to make matters worse, Ferrari even lost track of him on their GPS system. In a race defined by timing, execution, and precision, they got caught out again. And it didn't help that the SF25, already a tricky car in the dry, became an absolute nightmare in the wet. Snappy, unpredictable, and impossible to trust. It robbed Lewis and Charles too of the confidence needed to really lean on the car. But Lewis pressed on regardless. And that is what separates the greats. In conditions where most struggled to survive, he found speed. He extracted performance from a car that gave him no margin for error. One that, in the hands of another driver, would have struggled to get near the podium. His wet weather drives at Silverstone are always so amazing, balancing aggression with control and refusing to let the car's flaws dictate his ceiling. Even though the result wasn't what he or the fans hoped, it felt like a turning point, a moment where momentum finally might be starting to build. If he can carry this form into the upcoming weekends with just a little bit more luck and much fewer mistakes from the team, there's every chance that podiums, maybe even wins, aren't far away. And in the aftermath of the race, an Italian news outlet ran a headline that said, "Ferrari, it's time to listen to Lewis Hamilton." And from the moment this move was announced, there were plenty of naysayers. Those who claimed that this was nothing more than a quick cash grab, a flashy marketing ploy, a retirement tour in red. But to diminish it to just those reasons is to fundamentally misunderstand, or worse, insult, who Lewis Hamilton is. Remember, you're talking about a guy who's already made history, who's literally changed the sport and completely transcended it. The truth is, Lewis didn't choose to leave Mercedes. Not entirely anyway. The team he gave everything to was already looking beyond him, offering him a one-year deal with an optional second, planning around their next big prospect. The higher-ups didn't value him the way they once did, and Ferrari pounced on the opportunity. They didn't see a fading star. They saw a leader, a fighter, someone who still had more to give. And so, he went where he was wanted, where he could write a new chapter. And sure, it's been far from smooth. There have been painful lows, missed chances, mechanical failures, strategic blunders, but Lewis has shown up every single time, with integrity, resilience, and the hunger of a man still chasing greatness. The media will write their headlines, and it's easy to criticize from the outside when things go wrong. But when he does deliver, when he pulls off something spectacular, let the praise be as loud as the disrespect. The first half of Lewis Hamilton's debut season in Ferrari has been a rollercoaster, but the story is far from over. I hope you all enjoyed. Let me know what you think of Hamilton's Ferrari career so far down in the comment section below. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel if you're new to get my latest videos in the future. And as always, I'll see you in the next one.